Welcome to the Healing Place podcast, a space filled with inspirational stories of hope, along with practical advice for your healing journey. Your host is Teri Wellbrock, trauma warrior, writer, speaker, blogger, therapy dog handler, and founder of the Sammy's Bundles of Hope project. As a survivor and a thriver, Teri's mission is to shine the light of hope into the world by interviewing insightful guests from across the globe. Please stay tuned at the end of today's interview as we honor our sponsors. The Healing Place podcast is a fiscally sponsored project of Fractured Atlas. Now, here's your host and trauma warrior, Teri Wellbrock.
Welcome, everybody, to the Healing Place podcast. I am your host, Teri Wellbrock, and excited to have with me today, Lara, did I say it?
Yes.
Kain. Yay! So welcome. So I have to read it only because my menopause brain, it flies out. Educator, consultant, national speaker, and ACEs Connection. You work for ACEs Connection, which is I'm a huge, huge fan of. So yeah, I'm really excited to have you here with me today.
Thanks for asking me to join you.
Absolutely. So yeah, what do we want to dive into first?
Well, I can give you an overview of kind of all of the things I have going on now, and then maybe we can talk about the road to that.
Awesome. Sounds perfect.
So like you said, I work for ACEs Connection. So I am the Southern California community facilitator, and I'll explain kind of what that looks like in a minute. I'm also a consultant, so I consult directly with schools all over the country around trauma-informed, resilient building practices. And I'm a keynote speaker and former educator, and I'll talk about that when I kind of explain how I got here. So currently, as the ACEs Connection Southern California community facilitator, my job is to help any community in Southern California, which is a big area, right?
Oh, yeah.
That wants to build a cross-sector resilience building movement in their community. So none of this work that we're trying to do can be done by one agency, one person. It has to be a collaborative web that supports families and communities so they can thrive, right? So that is exactly what we're trying to foster. And we have the online network through ACEs Connection. The communities have pages where they can talk with each other, but also, of course, the national, ACEs Connection page where people can get all sorts of resources. But then on the ground, we help facilitate meetings sometimes or get them started, help them organize a screening of resilience if they want to. There's a lot of different ways that these have gotten started. And that's really exciting because although I've started off in education, it's clear to me that schools can't do this work alone. A school has to be doing this work within a community and have partnerships in the community and support from the community. So they are one part of this interconnected web.
Yeah.
So looking at it from a very interconnected systems view.
Right. I totally relate to that because I worked in a mental health agency in the Cincinnati area, and I was assigned to various schools, but that agency was working in collaboration with these elementary schools and middle schools. And what a huge need there was and is in the schools, and even more so than what I could provide or the agency could provide, because there were so many kids, particularly in the one school that comes to mind that I was thinking of. It was in a community that there was a lot of heroin addiction going on with parents, and just the demands on the teachers and on the staff and these kiddos that were just struggling just in their home environments and then coming to school, obviously, with struggles. I love the idea of it being community.
It has to be. I mean, and especially like in Ohio, this, like the opioid crisis has affected kids, and schools, they're not immune from this, right? If kids are not with their parents and they're placed in foster care, or their parents have overdosed, or all of these things that are happening to children that they can't control, that comes to school with them. And
Yes.
schools are left with trying to figure out how to respond in a way, that everyone there cares and wants to respond, but they aren't equipped necessarily, and they need partnerships, and they need training, and they need support. We need to address this from a community standpoint. Otherwise, kids really lose out.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
Yes. And I think the more that the community understands the impact, that it's not just, oh, this person is an addict, but how is that impacting their children? How is that
Right.
impacting, that grandparents are now raising these children, and there's just so much to it.
Yeah.
Um,
And as we understand ACEs science more deeply, we see how much of addiction is related to ACEs, right? So these
yeah,
adverse childhood experiences we use and become addicted to numb the pain that we're not dealing with. And it's all related to trying to interrupt. That's why we're working so hard to try to interrupt these ACEs upstream, right? So
yes,
looking
right,
at looking at how do we prevent them, and of course heal those of us that are already grown and have them, but really we are highly focused on how we can be preventative and
right,
support communities so that they're thriving, healthy, resilient places where people can get the support that they need. And that's a big, I mean, that's a big task. We're looking at, a long-term plan, but we have to start thinking that way now, if we want to make these big changes societally in schools. We have to really be forward thinking and start working hard to do that now, for
right.
sure. So that is my work with ACEs Connection, which I just love because it's so related to where I started and where I came from, and it's just an extension of my work with schools. And so, and like I said, then I also spend quite a bit of time traveling and working with schools directly that want some like hands-on guidance, coaching through. Uh, how, and again, similarly with communities, schools can't dabble around the edges with this. If they really want to make significant change, they need to go deeply. Look
Right.
at policies, practices. Their school board needs to understand this. It has to be a systemic effort in a school and district. And that's a huge task. And again, long term, we're looking at the long view, 5 years at least, to make these kind of big changes. But of course, there's things that you can do right away. So that often schools need some kind of outside technical assistance in guiding them through what that looks like and what does it look like in the classroom and teach. I mean, I went to a really, really excellent school of education, and I wasn't prepared for any of this, none
Right,
of it,
right.
and most teachers aren't,
I was
right?
going to say most teachers are not, right.
No, no, no. And I got a good education, and I was really excited. I was like 25, and I walked into. I was a teacher in an alternative high school, which by choice, that's really what I wanted to do. And yeah, in the first couple of days, I was like, wow, I am not prepared for this at all, and I need to really, really think about how I'm gonna approach this to be successful
Right.
um, with my students. So I think one of the things that I really leaned on, and I've talked about this in some of the blog articles that you've read, that I went to a high school that was very much rooted in the ideals of progressive education. So we're talking about like way back in the late 1800s, like Dewey, Montessori, people that really believed in the humanness of schooling, letting kids explore, being relationship focused, being hands-on project based, very relevant, very real. Um, a lot of the stuff that we're starting to talk about now, like this is a somewhat recycling of ideas in a new
Yeah.
context, right? And in the 70s, 60s and 70s, again, there was this big resurgence of progressive education models that were tried. And my high school was a really unique partnership between the Ford Foundation and the University of Wisconsin, and it was a public high school. And it was small, like 300 kids, and you go there by choice. And it was a very collaborative effort between teachers and parents and kids. It was very democratically run. Students made decisions about policies and practices, as did, teachers rotated who was the principal. And it was kind of like the not it, like no one wanted to be the authoritarian role, because these were a bunch of kind of radical hippie teachers, of course, in the 70s. And but a lot of the things that the school did, again, are so relevant now in this framework of like creating healing schools that are healing, heart-centered, but yet still focusing on, academics and,
Right.
learning. But what does that mean? Like, what is the purpose? What kind of learning are we talking about that really sets kids up for success when they leave school and ready for college? And this school had the primary focus was on relationships between adults and kids. That every student felt connected to an adult in the school. And this is, I was in school in 1986, right? So we're talking about stuff that we're trying to do right now, back then, right? So really thinking about relationships, connection, then using that lever to drive a sense of belonging and community. We were a family, and that drives academic pursuit. We were passionate about being there. We felt like we belonged. We felt empowered to learn. So we were given a broad, view, like, what are you interested in? Pursue, really passionate about, and that teaches you how to learn. And so it was less focused on the technical aspects of memorizing dates and facts, and more emphasis on co-constructing learning with the adults. They were more like facilitators, guides of learning, and we were there to be scholars. Everything was Socratic method. Everything, we read books and discussed them deeply. We learned how to we talked about critical race theory when I was in 10th grade. We were talking about these very deep concepts, and they always tried to relate it to what was going on around us in the world. And when we did fall down, there were times when I, was very much exhibiting my at-risk youth behaviors, right? And not going to school or not making good choices. They stepped right in and said, we miss you. Why aren't you at school? What's going on? How can we help? They came to my house. They knew my parents. It was a very deep relationship. And sometimes when you're 16, you don't want it. You're like, get out of my business. Right. But really, they were there for us when we stumbled, which of course we did. And many of us, and I know alums that went to school in the 70s, I know alums that went to school in the 90s, still have these very deep relationships with our teachers, with the adults in our lives that made a difference for us. And I was very, very prepared for college, I felt like, because I knew how to learn. I knew how to dive right in. I knew how to be interested in things. I didn't need someone telling me what to memorize or what to read. Like, it was very self-directed because of that experience. So when I think about if our goal in schooling is towards academics, that we're reaching that goal as well by being so heart-centered in our pursuit. So I'm just trying to lay the groundwork so that when I went to become a teacher in an alternative high school, and I thought I was going to do things kind of as I was instructed to do in college, I quickly had to kind of throw all that out and go back to what I knew worked from my own experience. Love my students, empower them to learn, meet their basic needs first, and really focus on that relationship for discipline if I needed to, or, to encourage them to make good choices. And I would just say that the one thing that I didn't know anything about was self-care. And I epically failed at that and dramatically burnt out at the end because I was trying to do everything. And I think that really informed my perspective around this community support, right? This school was trying to meet the needs of kids who'd experienced an immense amount of trauma. Most of my students had very high ACE scores. I didn't know any of this at the time. I didn't know this language, right? But I knew that what they were experiencing outside of school was coming in the building with them. They weren't leaving it at the door, of course. None of us can do that, especially, 15, 16-year-olds. And that what the school was trying to really, I mean, I drove my kids to drug treatment. I took them to college applications. I took them to the doctor. I was there when their babies were born. Like way beyond what you think of as a scope of a teacher, right? But it felt like it was so needed. And if we had a better system of support around us, then we would have, both my teaching partner and I would have been a lot healthier adults.
Yes.
We didn't
So much
understand.
is going through my head right now. I mean,
I didn't know anything about vicarious trauma, but I'm listening to my students every day talk about what's going on at home and things they can't control, and the drug abuse and the domestic violence and the, just all of the things that they're trying to manage as young people, and taking it all in. And I didn't know that I was supposed to do something about that, to not let it affect.
Right.
So it just piled in and piled in and piled in until I experienced what now I know is, compassion fatigue, where I was just like, I can't hear anymore. I can't listen anymore. I don't want to know anymore. I can't take it. I just had another student, die, or, I just had, like, there was just so many things where I'm like, I cannot keep going. And I thought for a long time that somehow that was a failure on my part, that I didn't have what it took to stick in there, right? Like, I failed them. I wasn't strong enough. So when I came across, I was in Wisconsin working at the Department of Education there as the state homeless coordinator. Still working with, kids, but a little bit more protected, I guess, from the direct impact. It was when I first learned about ACEs and trauma and self-care and compassion fatigue, and my head exploded. completely, changed my world.
Yes. Yeah, for sure. And again, I have a million thoughts going on, because everything you said is just, I relate to it in so many levels, because yes, I remember driving home from sessions with kids in these schools and bawling my eyes out to my kids on the phone, like, oh my gosh, and coming home and thinking, I can't do this anymore. It's hurting my soul. Mm-hmm. But I knew that these kids needed me, and yeah, I get it totally.
Yep.
But one of the things that pops in my head is, I just did a video for another friend and podcast guest, and it was #OneCaringAdult, and it was the impact of one caring adult, and that's what makes me think about. I know I saw you work with Jim Sporleader, and I love Jim. Jim's been on the podcast, and the work that he did in the high school in Washington. It just, that one caring adult, and if we can get more and more and more of those #OneCaringAdult, you, again, as a community, then it's not, you don't feel like it's all on your shoulders, right? On that teacher that feels like, I have to save these kids or do everything that I can.
Yeah, absolutely.
So your job is to bring these resources together so that it does become one caring community, really.
That's right. Because I often, when I'm talking with teachers, I was a teacher, I get it. I know there's another person coming in telling you about this new initiative and this thing you have to do, and you have to be this amazing adult for all of these kids, right? And it feels super overwhelming, and it's easy to just be like, nope, I'm going to close my door and I'm going to keep doing things like I did before. But if we think about this as a collective, that you don't have to be that adult for every kid in the building. You need to be that adult for a few kids. And if everybody has that approach, then ideally, right, all of the kids have that one person. And it doesn't have to just be a teacher. It can be any adult in that school building, that interacts with them.
Yeah.
I've had some kids where it was the bus driver or the lunch lady or it can be the secretary. It can be anybody that's interacting with them that they feel like is their advocate, that truly sees them for who they are and will go to bat for them and cares about them authentically, and wants to know how they're doing. If we approach that as a collective, I even in a really big school, I believe like we can make that happen. And I also, for me, that's a huge reason why I advocate for not having such big schools. I mean, even if we take really big high schools and break them into pods, schools have gotten very creative about how they design their hallways, like freshman only hallways, or, grade level teams or family housing units. Like they have everybody's developed into, groups of maybe 500 kids, that really allows us the chance to know our kids and not be overwhelmed by the numbers. I mean, it's insane when we try to have classes of 35, 40 kids, especially in a high school where you have that many, 5 or 6 times a day. And then we're like, build relationships with your students, and you have 50 minutes to do that and do everything else that we're asking you to do. So for me, that's why I try to approach this from a very systemic approach, that we need to disrupt the system that we have. We know what works. Decades of research from the top psychologists, education experts, child development, neurology, you name it. We know what works for kids. We know what employers are looking for. There's a whole 21st century learning movement, right? That we know what we need to do, and it's not what we're doing right now.
Right.
And that it's a behemoth system. I get it. Like, I know that we're talking about moving a mountain, but we have to start one school at a time, one district at a time, one kid at a time. We have to change the way we do things, because we're not doing the best we can for kids. We're not preparing them for the world, and we're often doing harm. I mean, I am the biggest public school champion out there you will find. I love school. People think I'm weird, like I'm super nerdy about school, but I'm also its biggest critic, with much love, right? Because I want it to be at its best potential. I think that schools have done so much harm and have been places, historically been places of trauma for so many families, especially families of color and families from communities that are high poverty or, on the fringes. School is not a safe place.
Right.
Parents don't feel comfortable coming to school. They had horrible experiences with school. When I was a teacher and I worked in this alternative program, it took us years to build trust with some of our parents, because they had such harming, hurtful experiences done to them by school administrators or teachers, or people who really harmed them, and they couldn't get over that. And so we have a lot of work to do to rebuild that sense of psychological safety for everyone, and trust, and really be willing to examine the policies that we have that might be doing harm when we're looking at exclusionary discipline. Like, for me, this is all part of this.
Yes. And it does seem overwhelming, but I love the idea of what you just said, of one kid at a time, one classroom at a time, one teacher at a time, because that's how that change is going to happen.
Yeah. Yes. And I have people are like, this can't be done. I'm telling you, there are examples all over the country. Here in Los Angeles, where, on a public LA school with, that's a neighborhood school, that's high poverty, that's, 99% Latino, where people would say that can't be done. It is being done. Everywhere there are examples of these shining lights that are showing us the way of how they have completely worked within the system that exists, with the funding that exists, and completely changed the experience for kids and adults in that building. Because it's important that the adults have a good experience in that building too. It needs to be a community for them. We need to build collective care. Just like we're talking about building relationships with kids, teachers, we can't just say, take care of yourself. Go take a bubble bath. Go, whatever.
Right.
Because that also becomes burdensome. Then you're like, great, that's one more thing I'm failing at. I can't do that either. It needs to be collective care. So there needs to be policies in place. There needs to be a wellness room for teachers where they can go recharge, right? They need their space too.
I was just going to say that I saw an article about that had a wellness room for teachers. And what I found fascinating, because I'm a big fan of reading comments from people, because I think that helps gives, an understanding of where the general community, people in general, are coming from. And obviously you have trolls on things that,
I'm always afraid of the comments.
Right? They're poking the fire just so they can get responses. But, some of these people would say, I understand about, self-care and la, 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 but what about the kids? Why don't the kids have a self-care room? And la, la, la. And so how many people were coming back and defending these teachers and saying, you don't understand the need for this for these teachers. And I loved seeing that, is that I think there really is sort of an understanding within the community that they're starting to get it, that teachers do need this support, because then their kids are getting that support.
That's right. I mean, it's that, that whole thing. You need to put your oxygen mask on first before you can help anybody else. Your bucket needs to be full before you can fill anyone else's bucket. And if teachers are underappreciated, overworked, exhausted, not cared for, they are going to burn out and leave. And they are. We need to build systems of support around them. And I mean, culturally, we need to appreciate them. It's the hardest job. It's right up, it's always listed as one of the most stressful jobs, right up there with nursing, right? People, and they get paid, like, don't even get me started, right? So our budgetary priorities need to change, right? We need to take care of our teachers. We need them to be there for our kids. We need them.
Yes.
Without them, what are we going to do?
Right.
And we're taking them for granted, and that's not okay.
No. Yeah, for sure. All right. So, talk to us a little bit. I mean, obviously we still want to talk about, some of your other roles, but your personal journey.
I mean, some of it is intertwined in what I talked about, for sure. Like as a kid, I was a wild teenager. I had been a victim of sexual abuse as an early teen, like tween, and didn't know how to deal with it. Didn't deal with it quite well in the beginning, and then that came out in all sorts of ways, right? Because it does. It comes out. It's going to come out one way or the other. And I went wild, and was being very destructive, and thought I knew everything and was just having fun. And but I was, of course, as an adult, you look back and you're like, oh, if my kids did any of that, like blah blah blah, like I make fun of myself. But of course, at the time, I was just acting out all of the pain that I was feeling, and along with just normal teenage angst and developmental stuff. And it really was a collective of support that put me back on track. And school was one of those. When I was in 8th grade, I had pretty much determined that I wasn't going to go to school anymore. I was done. School had been a place of, like, elementary school was amazing. Middle school was horrible for all of those reasons, all of that combined. And I was like, that's it. I told my parents, I'm not going. I will not put myself through that, and I'm just going to run away, and join the circus, pretty much. Like,
right.
And it was a collective of, like, I had some really great peers that had their heads together. My parents put me in therapy, at a young age, like in a support group with my peers that had experienced some sort of sexual assault or sexual violence. And then this, becoming, someone else told me about this school that I should check out, and then going there and becoming part of that family and having more adults that, cared. So then as I started to exhibit what I would say, those maladaptive behaviors, right? Once I had more caring and more love and more support, those started to diminish. And I started making healthier choices and really caring about myself a lot more, and wanting things to look different, and wanting, just instead of having all of these negative feedback loops, it reversed, and I started having all these positive feedback loops. And all of a sudden I wanted to go to school, and I wanted to leave my bedroom. I wanted to be surrounded by all of this kind of happiness around me, and that took a village, for sure.
Yeah.
And there were moments, like, like I said, where you start to slide backwards, but when that happened, there was immediate intervention. Someone was there, either a friend or a teacher, or someone in my family was like, wait, nope,
right,
nope, you have to. So I think that for me, that's definitely why I was able to come out on the other end okay, and look and have this. I always call it I have. I'm lucky to have this hindsight, lucky to be able to look back and be able to analyze what happened instead of still being mired in that quicksand that you feel, when you're in the middle of so much like pain and growth. And it's not that I have everything together, not at all, but you can look back and see and identify like what worked for me and what worked, what do we need to do so that other people, other kids have that experience. And my husband and I adopted 2 boys as infants, and it's that as well has been a learning journey. One came to live with us when he was 2 months old, and I think in the beginning everyone was like, well, he was under a year, so there's no effects
Right.
from that experience. And the other one came home with us from the hospital, and of course then I start to listen to Bruce Perry talk, and I read his books, and I start learning about developmental trauma, and I start to in what happens in utero, and the more I learn, the more I can understand that there is no, well, that doesn't count, or that doesn't matter, or that didn't have an effect. Like every part of our development has an effect on where we are now.
Sure. Well, now generational trauma, I mean, that's or are we passing it down through our genes? I mean, that's profoundly deep. And to me, I just think it's fascinating because, well, that could be a whole other podcast, but I think, how do birds know to fear a hawk, right? Or whatever coming in? Because something happened, and then it becomes part of their DNA, and then it's passed on and passed on and passed on. And then suddenly they know, right?
That's right.
What happens when a parent experiences trauma and then they have this child? And is that part of the DNA that then's passed on? Then that's something to be feared, even though this person never had any experience with that thing to be feared. It's fascinating to me. So, yeah.
Right. And it's a combination of, genes are a combination of expression and environment. So how they're expressed, the marker might be there, but our environment determines greatly how that expression comes out. And I think about that a lot. I mean, one of my kiddos has a lot of mental health. Sorry, that was my cat. A lot of mental health challenges. And I think about, we do have very open adoptions with both kids, and we do know a lot about his family history, and there is a lot of trauma, high ACE scores, mental health issues, and what happened in those 2 months prior, and we don't, there's just a lot of unknowns, and the more I do this work, the more I learn about the science, the more I think about that. And the other big learning for me that happened in the last 2 years, and mostly because of Emily Daniels, I know you've interviewed her. She and I do a lot of work together. Yeah. This work with Jim was the 3 of us doing it together, right? Yeah. That you talked about, was this whole body of work around somatic experiencing and the polyvagal theory and the nervous system. I didn't know anything about that, but when I learned about it, I was like, it was that second, like, that lightning bolt, like, oh,
I am right there with you. I'm like, what?
That sense of safety in the body, and for me, having already done so much work with teachers directly in their classroom, coaching them, helping them look at their lesson plan, really deep work with teachers around becoming trauma-informed practitioners, this was the big missing piece, because they were still saying, this is great preventative stuff, because I'm very universal, like we're taking a very universal approach to this, and redesigning our classrooms and our lessons so that everybody benefits, and we're very preventative. And they were like, that's great, but I still have kids throwing a chair at me, or cussing me out, or flipping me off, or or all these things that are happening in the moment that they get triggered, right? They get riled up, and that they get dysregulated, and the kid's already dysregulated, and they continue this, they dysregulate each other. So I can say to them, a dysregulated adult can't help a dysregulated kid. I can say that, I can write it on the board, I can have a PowerPoint slide with that on there, and they're like, great, I believe you, but what does that mean for me?
Now
How do
what?
I do that?
Right.
Like, what do I, and I was like, I don't know. I'm like, I don't really know the answer to that. So when I met Emily and I started to really understand this body of work around the body, I was like, oh my gosh, this is the missing piece that I haven't been able to really explain or understand, or yeah. And so that's why she and I started doing so much work together. We've done a bunch of trainings together, conferences together, because we were like two puzzle pieces. You know, not only complementary in our training style, we're very experiential when we do work with groups, very interactive. A lot of stuff around, you know, that we bring up from, again, like this is stuff from the 70s, like project adventure, challenge by choice, ropes course stuff, team building. Like, you know, we make teachers do all these ridiculous exercises and not quite trust falls, but you know, you could.
Yeah.
But this kind of stuff, because it builds psychological safety, and understanding the importance of that in a group dynamic. I already knew that part, but how we do it in the body, I didn't I didn't have as much understanding about how we feel safe enough. And that's when we can really dive into learning as adults, if we are in a group where we feel safe. And that creating that felt sense of safety is huge. And it's challenging now as a parent who has mental health supports in my home. Now I feel like I'm having to teach like the therapists that come into my home to work with my kid about this concept, because they don't know it either.
Right.
And I'm trying to get them to understand that he needs to feel, you know, a felt sense of safety and, you know, all of this stuff. And they're just like, I don't know what you're talking
love it. I think it's awesome. Well, I want to make a left turn just for 1 second, because when you were talking about Emily, I love when the universe aligns and things. It's just crazy awesome to me. So when I started working for the agency that I referred to earlier in Cincinnati, on my first day, I'm sitting in this boardroom waiting to do, you know, all the paperwork with HR. And this person comes in and sits down next to me. And so we start a conversation, and she had been hired in as a therapist, and it was her first day. And so this friendship developed right there in that moment. And we ended up working together on some things in classrooms, like she would come into a classroom that I was in. And well, then we both ended up leaving within, I want to say, 2 weeks of that agency. She went to do her thing and I went to do my thing. Well, she was brought in as executive director for the Tri-State Trauma Network here in this area, and her name is Melissa Adamczyk. Well, she invited me 2 years ago to speak at her fall conference, and so I went and spoke about my story, which was my first time standing before 250 people, you know, talking about my story for 45 minutes. And well, here last October, so a month and a half ago, Emily was the featured speaker. Melissa brought her in at the conference, and so I was just like, oh my gosh, Emily, I had her on the podcast and she's awesome. And so so I was telling Melissa how wonderful it was that she was bringing her on board. So I
have been, that's one of the things that I'm so happy, and happy is not even like the right word, but you know, to be able to connect with people deeply, like Emily, like Jim, you know, like, you know, all of my colleagues at ACES Connection, you know, that really, they make my heart grow, you know, and it's an amazing community to be part of. They're incredibly supportive, and I haven't met anyone that's come at this work, that isn't coming from such a, I don't know how to describe it, like a deep heart perspective. You know, they really are coming at it with so much love.
Yeah.
And then trying to figure out like what's their avenue, how can they make a difference, but we're all trying to disrupt the systems that are causing harm with so much love and intention. Yes. Sometimes it's technical, you know, and sometimes it's but this movement is so fueled by all of the immense caring and passion to make things better. And so that feels really good. Like, whenever I start to get kind of discouraged, or like you said, this is so overwhelming, and I need to give myself that little pep talk of like, okay, one school at a time, one kid at a time,
Yes.
I just think I sometimes I actually reach out to the people around me and go, I'm starting to lose faith. I'm starting to get discouraged. I need help.
Oh my
And
gosh, I did that yesterday.
yeah,
I seriously did. Like, I reached out to one of my previous podcast guests who I consider a friend, and I was like, because I knew she would get it. And I said, oh my gosh, one, I'm feeling imposter syndrome. And two,
yeah,
oh my gosh, this is like crazy overwhelming. So, and it was just a reminder, and there's just a beautiful reminder. I even think I may have put it out on the Healing Place Podcast Facebook page. And so the support has been, of, just keep remembering you're doing this from a place of compassion, and just, you can only do what you can do. Like, I can only do so much. So,
yeah. And if I didn't, and I'm not very good about, reaching out and asking for help, or reaching out and telling people, I'm always like, I'm fine, everything's fine. That's always fine. Right. And that's been also like one of my big, things for myself that I'm trying to work on, is to be vulnerable. Like, I'm all about Brene Brown right now. Like, how do I be vulnerable and get in the arena and get my butt kicked and not, be vulnerable. That's like my mantra. Be vulnerable, be vulnerable.
Yeah.
Like, there's, you're in a safe place. And so part of that is letting people know that I'm not fine and that I need help that day, or I'm feeling discouraged. And, or if I had a really great training in Idaho, not too long ago, and it was just one of those days where you left and you were like, yes, like that was amazing. And the energy was so great. And I called Emily. Like, of all, I was like, I need to call someone who gets this, like you just said.
Right.
All this, and she was just like, yes. I needed that boost. I needed to remember that there's a reason that this is so important. And I think that happens, working in communities through ACEs Connection all the time. That's why we're trying so hard to tell stories too, right? And focus on the storytelling, because otherwise you can get lost in the big picture. And telling the individual stories is what reminds us that it makes a difference.
Yes. Amen and hallelujah. Yeah. One thing that I do, the word appeared often on your website, and I've just been seeing some controversy over it. Do you mind talking just a little bit about what is resilience? And,
I
the
love that
philosophy
question.
behind it.
Oh my God, I love it. So I agree. I mean, I love the discussion that's going on around that word. And I think it's great, because I think if we're asking people to be resilient in a system that's unjust, that's wrong. That's not okay. So if we're not addressing, the systemic racism that occurs, the, harm that some of our capitalist system is doing to our communities, the fractured support systems that exist, if we're not addressing the systemic roots, these adverse community experiences, right? If you think about the Pair of Aces work, if we're not addressing the systemic roots of our adversity, and we're just asking people to be resilient in the face of injustice, then that's not okay.
Well, I don't even think it's like doable.
No. I mean, it's like asking kids, like, we want you to be resilient in this system that's harming you.
Yeah.
Where you have no power, you have no voice, and you just have to deal with what's given you, or be pushed out, and be resilient, pull yourself up, be strong. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the ability within a healthy, supported community to be able to face some adversity and bounce back with support. But it's because we're never going to erase adversity.
Right.
We can try to build structures that don't cause so much chances for adversity, right? We can rebuild our systems to be more just, but
death happens, accidents happen.
That's what I'm saying, right? We're never going to not have these things happen in our lives. Sorrow and pain and grief are part of life too. but how do we learn how to face that as a community with support and bounce back? Resilience, I always think of it as like the ability to come back, not just grit your teeth against the wind, right? Against a storm. It's not just like grin and bear it and, face. It's about bouncing back in a really healthy, authentic way where you're going to rise and fall. And it's interesting. I've had this conversation with colleagues whose first language is Spanish, and the translation to resilience in Spanish is more like resistance, sort of. It doesn't make sense to them. It doesn't translate in a healthy way. So they've been like, that doesn't really,
right.
It doesn't really make sense. And I think that's a lot of the conversation that has come out recently. And I'm so glad that people are willing to have that conversation, and we need to be critical of ourselves and our language, and be careful about the words we use and how we say it and the intention that we have behind it, and be clear about when we say that we want to build a resilient community or a resilient environment, what we mean by that.
Yeah. Well, and I said resilience was a new concept when I came across ACEs Connection. Like, I didn't even know what resilience was. People would ask me, "How did you survive all of that you went through?" And I'd say, "I don't know. I don't know how I did it." But then as I started to realize and study and learn and research, and my grandma Kitty, she was powerful force in my life. And so when I made this little video that I talked about the one caring adult, I feel like she yes, it was resilience, but the bottom line it came down to, she loved me. She cared about me, and she never hit me. She didn't yell at me. She was this presence in my life that made me feel valued.
Mm-hmm.
And truly, I feel like that's what it is. I don't know if that's what built, quote unquote, resilience in me, but I think it was just this internal sense of value that the seed she planted inside of me. That's what I held on to. That's
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is when they try to, the Center on the Developing Child at Harvard has done a great job of trying to help us understand the science of resilience and how it comes about in our body, what it looks like in a community. I use their resources all the time because they're meant for people who aren't scientists to understand this science of resilience, and that connection is at the root of it.
Yeah.
Whether it's it's one person and a community connection and that sense of belonging, that's the root of our resilience. So we need to figure out how we're building that in to everything that we do, so that there's opportunities for constant connection and caring, so that when people face adversity, they have a well to go to.
Yeah.
A well of support, a well, that person, that sense of connection, of community of faith, whatever it is that helps buoy them up when they can't do it themselves until they can.
Yeah.
And then they feel like they can feel okay on their own. But a lot of our communities are set up for isolation, not connection. And I think a lot of this great community-based resilience work is that's what they're focused on, is creating opportunities for connection and trying to eliminate the isolation. I can't remember the exact quote, but Father Paul Abernathy, who led this work in Pittsburgh around developing resilient community, was, they had found people living in radical isolation, and now we're living in community. Like, that was the change, was taking people out of their houses and bringing them together and meeting their basic needs, and providing the opportunity for connection. And that, from that well, sprang the change that they needed to see in the neighborhoods. But it was that deep sense of connection that sparked it.
Yeah.
So when we talk about what communities need to do, I mean, do presentations for ACEs Connection often around the country on like building resilient communities, and that's the root of it, is how are you building community? Food, like, are you bringing people together to eat? Never underestimate the power of food.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, I have such a cool story to just say about that really quick. So we decided to go to Hilton Head, which is our favorite place in the world, last week, right? And we went, and we were like, what are we going to do for Thanksgiving? It was so off track of what we normally do with our big family Thanksgiving meal and so forth. So we went to a community Thanksgiving dinner on the island, and it was 400 volunteers from churches that came together, and it serves about 1,600 people every year. And then you can donate, and it goes towards a charity that helps on the island, or in the whole community. But it was the coolest thing to be at this community Thanksgiving. Like, I loved it, and made these connections. And I just got a text from someone that I met, the stranger in line. I gave him my business card, and so we just made this powerful connection. And it's just, to me, way cool. So I love that idea.
Yeah, because that wouldn't happen. Those kind of connections wouldn't happen spontaneously. Those authentic, the things you can never plan for, right? The people that you meet that you'd never thought it just is circumstance, but you have to set up opportunities for that connection to happen.
Right.
And if we're all just in our houses and not finding ways to come together, then we lose those opportunities. So whether you're thinking about schools or whether you're thinking about communities, keeping that in mind, like, how are we creating opportunities for connection every day, all day long?
Yeah.
So in your classroom, in your school building, with kids, with adults to adults, right? Like, how are we creating opportunities for connection? Because that is the foundation of our resilience, our support, this what we want to see happen in all of these different systems. It's the root of it is people, and are caring for each other.
Right. Well, thank you. No one, I've never really addressed just resilience, and so thank you for speaking to it.
No, it's great, and I hope the conversation keeps going, and with many voices speaking up, and that we deepen our understanding of because for me, that's just my response, right? And I welcome, like, I want to have a really thriving, deep discussion about that, because I think it can be something really good, but I think if we're not careful, it can be seen as, something not good, something harmful. So, I really appreciate that.
Well, I think that's why ACEs Connection, I can't sing their praises enough, that community, is because we do have so many voices present there that are giving, not necessarily opposing views, but just, there's healthy conversations happening that need to happen, because all of this is going to it's just helping form this amazing philosophy. That's growing and beautiful and wonderful. And so, So anyway.
And we can't do that without dialogue.
Right. Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
And we have to be willing to really to dig in, but for that you need a felt sense of safety. You need psychological safety, right? We need to create those safe places for discussion.
Exactly. We can have another 7-hour podcast. I just looked at the clock and I was like, oh my gosh, we've been talking an hour. That's crazy. And I wish we could talk for another couple hours, because this has been wonderful. But is there anything else that you wanted to address before we end?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. I know we talked about, I'm just looking at my notes. Oh, one thing I wanted to say, I love it that you put on your page, the beach is my happy place.
I can't even tell you.
Yes.
I mean, I grew up in Wisconsin, right? So
right. I'm in Ohio. I get it.
Now I am a hardcore California girl. Like, Teri, wait till you spend your first winter without winter. I can't even tell you. Yeah, I'm done. I'm never going back to winter ever. I can't, like.
No, we're so excited to move there, to move in June. And we said my oldest son lives in Denver. And so
Yeah.
our daughter, who's 13, is like, we can just fly to see John if we need
That's right.
snow.
That's
Like,
right.
absolutely. We could go to Colorado, see some snow, and then go back to the beach.
I can drive 6 hours to Mammoth if I really need to see big snow. And I mean, I miss my community in Wisconsin where I grew up. I miss my family, but living near the beach. I mean, when I start, and the other thing I start to do when I start to feel discouraged or overwhelmed is I just go for a walk at the beach.
Yeah.
I take my dog, I go for a walk. There's a great dog path right along the ocean, and it's just like the smell and the sound and what I'm looking at. Half an hour and I'm good. It's all it takes. Like just a good half-hour walk along the water and I'm totally reset. So yeah, I'm stuck. I'm never going to be able to not live near the beach again.
I get you on so many levels on this. So
I'm really excited for you.
Oh,
Every time I see your posts about that, I'm like, she's going to love it. She doesn't even know how much she's going to love it.
So in a year, I'm going to call you or text you and be like, hey, I'm so excited because it's winter and I'm not in it.
Your toes are in the sand. Yeah, it's winter and your toes are in the sand.
Yes.
Yeah.
That was us last week. I said, oh my gosh, it is, the week of Thanksgiving. It's November, the end of November. We looked at the weather and we're like, Cincinnati is, 34 degrees and rainy and windy, and we are in shorts.
Yep.
And my toes, like I didn't have my shoes on and my toes were down, screeched into the sand, and it was awesome.
Yep, you're gonna love it.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, this has been absolutely wonderful. I'm so glad that. How do people get a hold of you? That was the other thing. Yeah.
So I have a website, larakain.org, right? And I'm like, I think that's right. Yes.
Yeah.
And then email. So it's my name, Lara Kain 1. LARAKAIN 1 at Gmail. Those are probably the easiest ways, and then I can set up Zoom or phone conversations with people via either one of those.
Okay. And then through
ACES Connection, same also on ACES Connection. My if you look under the staff page, my email and information is there for Southern California. And I have blogs on there, and yeah, there's lots of ways to find me.
Okay, wonderful. All right. Well, again, thank you for everything you're doing, shining that light of hope into the lives of children and helping.
Well, thank you for giving us opportunities to talk about it, because a lot of times it's just me and my dog talking about it. So
I know. Well,
I appreciate.
I got Maxie on my lap. He's been a pretty good boy.
Oh, he's been so good. He's so quiet. Oh my God, he's adorable.
He is. He's ornery, but he's awfully darn cute. So
yeah,
we put up with him.
yeah. So I really appreciate. I love your podcast, and I love that you're giving all of us, this big community that we have growing, an opportunity to share with others. So like, I feel like you are one of those people that's providing the opportunity to connect. So
thank you. Thanks so much. I just I don't know. I love the idea of bringing voice to this movement and bringing voice to all of this and offering a space for that to happen. Last I checked, which was before vacation, this podcast has been downloaded in 48 countries, which is just it's mind-blowing.
That's amazing.
Yeah, but just the thought of this going out and reaching people everywhere in your beautiful message, I love it. So yeah. All right. Well, everyone, thank you for joining us on the Healing Place podcast. And remember, until next time, be gentle with yourself. All right. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for listening today to the Healing Place podcast with your host and trauma warrior, Teri Wellbrock. If you enjoyed this episode and want to learn more about Teri, her mission, and the Hope for Healing journey, visit Teri's website at www.teriwellbrock.com. Thank you for liking, commenting, sharing, and offering your reviews on our YouTube channel, audio outlets, and Facebook page. And as Teri reminds us, until next time, remember, be gentle with yourself.